Welcome to Illuminating Catholics, podcast of the Diocese of Sioux City. I'm Dawn Prosser, Director of Communications for the Diocese. Together with Carmen Bauer of the Faith Formation Office, we will shed light upon topics of faith in the modern church. Our guests include Catholic clergy, religious sisters, and other experts in their fields to help us understand what's happening in the church today. We will explore issues, even the tough ones, and to find answers to common questions about Catholicism. Thank you for joining us for today's Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Welcome back to the Illuminating Catholics podcast. My name is Dawn Prosser, and I am the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Sioux City.
And I'm Carmen Bauer. I am the Director of Faith Formation.
And we want to thank you all for joining us and listening to today's episode. So we're following up a little bit from an episode we ran just this March with Shiloh Ministries about in vitro fertilization and how it aligns or doesn't align with Catholic Church teaching. Since then, we connected with today's guest, Savannah Crossfield. She is the producer of an upcoming docuseries called Cradled in Class, and we'll have her talk about that. So welcome, Savannah.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is a great topic for us to cover, and it's a great opportunity to learn more about your work as well. So if we can kind of jump right in, can you just give us a little bit of background? Tell us about your work and your media company and maybe how you got into this.
Yes, so I had not known anything about in vitro fertilization. I don't have infertility. I don't know anyone in my immediate circle or my family or friends who've had infertility. And so the way I got introduced to this topic is that after I had my son, right after I got married, again, not infertile, I was looking on social media and I saw the statistic that I had never heard before, that there are 1.5 million frozen embryos, at least, in the U.S. right now. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I said, what? Why? Why are they there? Will they be coming out of cryopreservation? How long have they been there? I had so many questions, and I did some surface level research, learned about, of course, in vitro fertilization, did some initial research on how the process works, and immediately I felt that there were a lot of concerns that I was seeing as I was reading just medical papers about how the process works, that I didn't see too much of in the pro-life sphere or in the political sphere, or that people were really talking all that much about. And since then, there have been many different voices in the pro-life movement, or in bioethics, or in Christian circles, or all these different circles that have spoken about it. But I just felt that it was so much bigger of an issue that the general public didn't know all that much about, like I didn't, that there really needed to be a lot more advocacy or a lot more research done and people talking about this and things that were accessible to the public. So, obviously we have a ton of research papers, and we've got bioethics conferences that really only researchers and bioethicists are going to, but I felt that there needed to be something in depth, covering all the different facets of IVF and the industry, because it really is such an incredibly large topic, and there's so many other technologies that go along with the process of in vitro fertilization that need to be discussed and that people in the general public should be aware of and informed about, so that they personally can make informed decisions and wise decisions when they or a close family member are going through infertility or potentially have these embryos that might be theirs that are in cryopreservation. So just seeing that statistic brought me down a path of research and to want to do a thorough investigation and then bring that to the general public.
And was prior to reading that statistic and it just impacting you with the way it did, was your background in journalism and media? What kind of drew you to this form of telling this narrative?
Awesome question. So my background is in broadcast journalism, and I went to college for digital media and journalism, and ran a student newsroom in high school. And that was, the trajectory I thought I was going to take. And I've done a couple of film things, marketing, video, and along those lines. And then at 19, I got married. And then at 20, I had my son. So I felt like, I had all this schooling and education and experience, but I wasn't really using it. And so wonderfully, God put me in the position where I didn't have to go out and make money. And so I could really spend my extra time when you're a mom at home, on more mission work or my interests, instead of having to focus on, getting a job and do something that, that just to make money. And the other part of the question was, how did I bring this specific media? So I looked up if there were organizations already that were doing the kind of work that I was trying to bring to the public, specifically on the IVF topic. And I did not find any at the time. I'm sure they existed, I just didn't find them. So I was perfectly willing and able to join another group and help them out. I didn't necessarily want to start something on my own, but I didn't find what I thought needed to be out there. The other thing that I thought was important was to make a series that went in depth on this topic that was not necessarily faith-based, so that we could reach the masses in the secular media space. So, mainstream streaming platforms, mainstream television networks, mainstream news, because of course there's a lot more people that suffer from infertility than just, Christian and pro-life audiences. And I wanted to inform them as well. So making it accessible not only from an information standpoint, on not being too technical, but then also being accessible from an ideological perspective.
That's really interesting.
And that makes the best media to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you give us just a little bit of introduction into Lucidity Pictures and, an explanation of long-form broadcast journalism?
Sure. So Lucidity Pictures, I started in September last year, and the focus of that was to make a nonprofit long-form journalism production studio that focused on work in the either bioethics space or technology and how that interfaces with humanity, trying to focus on all of these new technologies that are coming out that humanity needs to know how to judge these technologies, and of course to be able to inform the general public. So our mission is to look into topics that affect our everyday life, that are underrepresented in mainstream media and the public conscience, that seek to better humanity. And that is how Lucidity Pictures was born. So we hope to be able to do other documentaries, in the future after this one, but this is the flagship project.
Okay. Why don't we just jump in and have you just kind of give us in a nutshell what this docuseries is about and how many segments and
Sure.
How much time in total you anticipate this being?
Oh yeah, of course. So our series covers a number of topics, as we discussed earlier. IVF is just one technology that branches out and requires a bunch of other technologies to be added to it. And so we have 6 different episodes, each with a different topic, under this IVF umbrella. And it's the first episode obviously gives you an overview of how the IVF process works, and highlights the surplus embryos that are created in any given cycle, because the odds of any given embryo successfully growing out in the petri dish to 5 days, which is when then you would transfer that embryo into the gestational carrier or mother's womb, and then hopefully that embryo would implant, and then you have your pregnancy of 9 months and then a successful live birth. So that's the intention, but statistically only about 5% of embryos created through in vitro fertilization are born alive. So given that, it is advantageous for IVF clinics to create a surplus of embryos so that they have more to evaluate, more chances of that successful live birth. And so in that first episode, we also go in depth on if you have a surplus of embryos after your IVF cycle and you have frozen them and you have, situations where you could have 8, 10, 12, 15 embryos, and parents, in a lot of times, this is a growing issue in America, feel this sense of dread and this sense of not knowing what to do with their embryos that are frozen, that they themselves don't intend to gestate or to raise and to have in their family. So that's, one of the topics that we cover in that episode. And then in the second episode, we discuss the alternative to in vitro fertilization for fertility treatment, which is restorative reproductive medicine. And so we interview all kinds of different professionals in this space, whether it be hormonal, fertility tracking, surgical, endometriosis treatment and surgery. And so we've got all these different topics in the large umbrella of restorative reproductive medicine. And of course, the purpose of this treatment is to find the root cause, identify the cause of infertility, and treat that so that one can go and naturally conceive and have multiple pregnancies and also be healthier. So we go in depth on that alternative to IVF. And then in the third episode, we look at at embryo loss, whether that be intentional or unintentional. So before we discussed how only 5% is the statistic that we've found through different data sources. 5% of embryos created through in vitro fertilization are born alive through a cycle. And so there's a lot of unintentional death throughout the IVF cycle, whether that be, the culture medium. We've seen studies showing that might contribute to embryonic death. There's a lot of manipulation that goes on in the IVF process, whether that be ICSI, which is intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where you're injecting a sperm into the egg, whether you're taking that and you are freezing that embryo for a certain amount of time, you thaw that embryo, you're transferring that embryo. This embryo could go through a biopsy for genetic testing. So we have all these manipulations that can also add risk to that embryo's death. So there's a number of factors that can play in here, but we look at the unintentional and then also the intentional death, which, for example, in genetic testing, there's different forms of genetic testing, like for single gene issues, also genetic testing for aneuploidy, which means chromosomal abnormality. So you're looking at, you take a biopsy on the 5th day of growth of that embryo, and then you look at those cells. You take about 6 to 8 cells from a 100-celled embryo. And then you're going to look at the chromosomes. You can also tell sex of the embryo at that time when you're looking at the chromosomes, of course. And parents, often clinics will give them the option of transferring the embryo of their preferred sex. So if a couple says, oh, we already have a boy, we just want a girl, then you could have a situation where you have, if the parents choose to, an intentional discard of embryos of the undesirable sex. Or if the embryos test unfavorably, looks like those embryos have leukemia. That's an issue, a single cell issue that you can test for. Or if, and this is a very flawed testing, and we can go in depth at a different time about why the results of testing for chromosomal abnormality like Down syndrome, Turner syndrome is flawed. But if those tests come back unfavorably, then those embryos will most of the time also be discarded. So you have all these intentional deaths as well. So that third episode goes in depth on the embryonic loss. And then in the fourth episode, we look at the embryo adoption, and we cover 2 different stories of specific embryos, children that are born now, that went through embryo adoption and their families. And so we cover the story of Jack Yoder, who his significance in his story is that he went through everything an embryo could possibly go through. He went through all the genetic testing. He went through, he is one of a large sibling set of embryos, and so they have a harder time getting adopted out. There's a lot of embryos that are frozen that are not necessarily wanted, but also not up for adoption. So you have that those odds against these embryos that aren't going to be gestated in their families. And so he went through all these things, and we were able to calculate his odds of being born alive through all this, and calculate it to 1 in 100,000. But he is here, so we've got that amazing story. And then the second story in that episode is of the Pierce family. And so they just, a couple weeks ago, broke the record for the oldest embryo ever successfully born. So they say oldest baby born. But we interviewed their family when they were pregnant with him. And so that's a pretty exclusive interview because a lot of people interviewed after the baby was born, but we got them before the baby was born. So so those are the two stories that we've gotten. He was 31 and a half years old. Wow. 31 and a half years in cryopreservation. And we also got to speak and interview his biological mother, who had put him up for adoption. And then, of course, the parents who adopted him. And some pretty amazing stories. And both of them are a testimony to show that even those embryos that look on paper like they have the lowest chance of survival, like, there's so much against them, that they still have worth and value, and that they should not be discarded. And we make the point that ASRM, which is the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, the board in the U.S. that makes guidelines surrounding IVF in this country. It's highly unregulated by law, so they have this board. And they, in 2022, through a committee opinion, had made the decision that it is both ethical and legal for cryobanks that are storing these embryos long term to discard embryos that have not been paid for and parents aren't contactable for 5 years. And so there are a lot of embryos that fall in that category because parents have to pay monthly or yearly, depending on the cryobank that they're storing with, for these embryos that they may not necessarily want. And so they may feel uncomfortable with the idea of putting them up for adoption, of another family raising their children, but they also don't want to pay if they're not going to be gestating these embryos, or the industry would say using these embryos. But they don't want to donate them to scientific research because that doesn't feel ethical, and they don't necessarily want to discard them. So then you have this limbo area where there's potential for embryos to be discarded because of non-payment. And so we would always encourage people to put their embryos up for adoption if they are not planning to have them themselves. And we also mentioned in that episode a couple of agencies, snowflake adoption is what you'd call it, but embryo adoption agencies that would be more than willing and very happy to take their embryos, and that way parents don't have to continue the cryo storage and those embryos have a chance at being born. So we encourage that in that episode. Then the fifth episode is about the legal landscape of IVF. And so embryos in every state but Alabama are considered property. And we look at what are the legal implications of that status. What are the practical situations that an embryo could be in? For example, in a custody battle, right? You have parents who, when they were married, created embryos together, and they both owned, because of their property, their embryos, and then those parents divorce. Well, what happens to those embryos? Let's say one parent wants to have them destroyed, does not want those embryos to be born, and then the other parent wants to have them and to gestate them or to put them up for adoption or what have you. And we've had a lot of differing court opinions in different states and rulings on this, and so looking at that. Then of course we have the surrogacy business, where you've got complications on birth mother versus surrogate. We have an embryo that may be biologically related to the surrogate but might not be, because we have donor sperm, donor egg. And so dealing with all those surrogacy laws. And then some states have outlawed surrogacy completely. So we have a lot of differences on that. We also look at donor egg and sperm, anonymity. If you're going to be a sperm donor in some places, it's totally okay for you to be completely anonymous, and no medical history would be shared with the parents who want to use your sperm. But in some situations, it is required that that information be passed on to the parents. And so we look at all the different complexities there. And then, of course, in Alabama, in 2024, there was an Alabama Supreme Court ruling where a couple was suing or many couples were suing for the wrongful death of their embryos when a person in said hospital, not connected to the clinic at all, a patient at the hospital, walked into a fertility clinic in Alabama, and the door and the security and the door on the area where the embryos were being stored in cryopreservation was not locked. And so that patient at the hospital waltzed in, got some of those embryos, pulled them out, dropped them on the floor because, they're being stored in liquid nitrogen. It's incredibly cold, so it burned the person and dropped the embryos. And those embryos died on contact when they fell. And so the couples, and not necessarily all of the couples because we can't know the details, but some of the couples whose embryos were destroyed had sued for wrongful death for this IVF clinic. And so upon appeal in the Supreme Court determined that the embryos, based on the laws in Alabama specifically, because Alabama has a history of pro-life laws and they have a very interesting wrongful death law. So they have all these intricacies that are Alabama specific, but they had determined that the embryos that were frozen were minors, and that the parents had standing to sue for wrongful death. And so we interview some primary sources in that ruling and some lobbyists and get really interesting information on what the myths are surrounding that ruling and the legislation that followed after it, and what the actual practical implications are for that ruling and for that law. And then how IVF stands in Alabama, and then if that it could affect IVF in other countries or in other states. So we just look at the effects of that ruling. Very interesting. And then the 6th episode, I'll be quick, goes into depth on human embryonic research. And so that also is a massive topic that is continuously developing because there's a lot of research currently being developed. And so we look at stem cell research, we look at biobags, which are the development of synthetic uteruses. We look at synthetic embryos, which are essentially, you take an embryo created through in vitro fertilization, and then you take the stem cells out of that embryo, you grow them out to different cell types, you can put them back together and make what looks like an embryo, exhibits some measure of growth, but it's not completely looking exactly like a natural embryo. And so there's a lot of bioethical concerns about this and what this could potentially lead to. And human synthetic embryos have been created, and it's the frontier on regulations on these. And then we also look at in vitro gametogenesis, which is another technology in the works that researchers expect to be able to come to fruition in the next 10 years, and that is taking adult stem cells, so you or I, our skin cells, for example, and then turning them into gametes. And there's a lot of different complex ways to do that, but if you can take an adult stem cell and turn it into a sperm or an egg, then there's a number of bioethical issues that you can bring into play, whether that be two women can then have a biologically related child. You could theoretically have 4 different women all creating a biologically related child, because 2 of the women, you make a sperm and an egg, 2 of the women, sperm and an egg, and then you can actually take embryos and then turn those and their cells into gametes. So those 2 women create sperm and egg, they are fertilized, so now you have 2 embryos. Those 2 embryos, sperm and egg, taking those embryos, turning their cells into sperm and egg, fertilizing those, and then creating another embryo whose biological parents are embryos, whose grandparents are those original 4 women. So, and then of course we have an issue of, consent to reproduction. If I can just take some of your skin cells or your hair, you don't necessarily have to know if I'm making biological children from that. So just, a whole episode on a bunch of very scary dystopian stuff. And the people who are doing the research are in there, so we've got a lot of primary sources. Very exciting.
Scary is the word that came to mind as
Yes.
you were describing some of that, to be totally honest with you. So what is your end goal? Like, we're talking about what's going on scientifically and so forth. What is your thought, the end goal, when people are watching it?
So our end goal is to be able to reach couples that are hurting, and we've interviewed so many couples themselves who have been through in vitro fertilization or been through infertility that, we really want to stress the compassion and the truth in all of this, and come alongside them and be able to say, I know you feel desperate. There have been so many people who have been right in your shoes and who felt like IVF was the only option, and felt that they didn't know why they were having infertility. They had been suffering for so long. Their doctor had said this is the only option for you, and it's so expensive. They mortgaged their house or scrambled together financing or all these things to put a shot in the dark and say, hey, maybe we'll get a child out of this, and put our bodies through all this and spend all this money, and then I'll be fulfilled and I will then have a child. And that's the only thing you can see at that moment is, I just want a child and I'll do anything for that. And we want to tell you there is another way. There are other options that are more ethical, that are more cost effective, that could make you healthier, and that really respect the human dignity in the process. And you don't have to sacrifice your health, your money, your finances, and potentially your children's lives in order to build the family.
So at one point you were fundraising for production, or is that part over, or are you still doing that for the project?
So we have, for the grace of God, we've funded our production, and so we're currently in post-production and kind of working as we fundraise it. So we are fundraising to finish off post-production, so we have a final product. And then after that, of course, we'll be fundraising for marketing. And we want to have 6 months of marketing, PR runs, go on a bunch of big podcasts, and speak to a lot more people. And then, to be able to do a marketing run with trailers on YouTube, etc., to really get the message out there for a summer 2026 release.
And we can put a link in show notes.
Definitely.
Awesome.
So when it is finished and wrapped up, do you have a formal relationship with a streaming platform or anything like that? How do you anticipate that people will be able to watch this series?
So we don't currently have a relationship with a streaming platform. We need to finish the series first and then pitch it and show them the whole thing, because obviously I'm sure all of your viewers know that this is a very controversial topic. and so anyone who has the possibility of putting the series on their platform really wants to look into it before doing so. So we have a couple of avenues of interested platforms, but we got to get the thing done before we know where you can see it. And we would like it to be available on multiple platforms, so you don't have to necessarily go get a Netflix subscription if you don't have one, because we want it to be accessible to as many people as possible.
And we'll definitely stay in touch with you on that. But understand
Awesome.
It takes time. It's a big project, 6 episodes that are so in depth.
Lots of interviews, I'd imagine. A lot of time spent.
we have 35 interviews, and the whole thing is 3 hours of content, so pray for me.
So when did you start filming? How long ago?
January.
Well, you did pretty good if you got that much done, and we're actually talking in August.
From January to May, we were just, traveling, production, filming all these interviews, exclusive access to different places and institutions. And then from June to now. It's just been editing.
Well, thank you so much, Savannah, for joining us today. Again, this docuseries is called Cradled in Glass, and thank you for all those who are listening today. And make sure you check out our show notes for all of the links to help, send you to Lucidity Pictures, and so you can get some more information yourself. And if you'd like to give and support, you're also welcome to do that. So thank you all for listening, and we'd like to invite our listeners, if you have not already, to subscribe to Illuminating Catholics.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Follow us for more episodes on topics of the Catholic faith. For more diocesan news, visit lumenmedia.org.